She dragged 11 massive wolves out of a frozen river in the winter of the coldest season the Northern Kingdom had seen in 40 years, and she never once suspected the 12th beast she pulled from beneath the ice, bleeding silver into the current, was the Alpha King of the entire Blackthorn pack. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from right now, and if you've ever had to save someone who looked at you afterward like you were the monster. Like this, if you believe in strength nobody sees coming. Subscribe if you want to watch a king kneel. Illyra Vantis was 22 years old, sharp-eyed and lean from years of hard winters, with calloused hands that could set a bone faster than most court healers could diagnose one. And for 6 years, she had lived on the edge of Blackthorn territory, in a 2-room cabin, with a collapsed roof beam she never had the coin to fix. The pack called her the Broken Healer, a title spat rather than spoken, because 6 years ago her father, a decorated wolf healer named Doran Vantis, had been publicly stripped of his rank and exiled for a crime the court never proved, only whispered. Illyra had been 16. She remembered the frost on the courtyard stones the morning they marched her father out through the gates, remembered the way not a single healer in the Blackthorn Infirmary had looked up from their ledgers. She had followed him into exile without hesitation, learned every remedy he still remembered under lantern light, watched him die of a wound that never should have killed a man who knew medicine as well as he did, a wound, she now suspected, that had been poisoned. She kept his brass medical case, dented at one corner, hidden beneath a floorboard, along with a folded letter, sealed with a crest she did not recognize, one he'd told her to burn, and never had the strength to burn herself. 3 threads pulled tight from the very first scene, and none of them would loosen until the very end. The first, a body freezing in the Kessa River, poisoned by silver shavings, worked directly into an old wound, a wound shaped wrong for any blade the northern packs carried, a wound Illyra would recognize, before the story was through, as matching the exact curve of a ceremonial dagger she had seen exactly once, in her father's stolen case. The second, a debt of scorn 6 years old, owed to her by a pack that had exiled an innocent man and never once apologized, a debt that had a face, Commander Rurik Thane, broad as a doorway, golden-eyed, who had stood in that courtyard as a young guard and said nothing, and who now, 6 years later, still called her the Crow's daughter every time she walked past the market stalls. The third, the question of what happens the moment 200 wolves watching a duel in the frost-covered training yard of Blackthorn Hall discover that the woman they've spent 6 years calling broken has hands steady enough to hold a king's heart in place while it stops beating twice. The Blackthorn pack ruled the northernmost of the 7 wolf kingdoms, a territory of black pine and granite cliffs that plunged straight into the Kessa River, a river that never fully froze, even at the deepest point of winter, because something in the current ran warmer than it should. The pack's founding law, carved into the stone archway of Blackthorn Hall in letters 2 hands high, declared that any soul, wolf or human, who drew a member of the royal bloodline back from the threshold of death by their own skill, without coercion or reward demanded, would be granted a formal hearing before the full pack council, entitled to name one boon the Alpha King himself could not refuse. Nobody alive remembered the last time it mattered. Illyra knew none of this the night she went out to check her fishing lines on the Kessa, and found the ice along the eastern bank cracked into a black spider web, and beneath it, a shape too large to be any animal she'd treated before, nearly 9 feet from muzzle to haunch, fur the color of wet slate, one foreleg bent at an angle bone should never bend. She waded into her waist in water cold enough to stop a human heart in 4 minutes, wrapped both arms around a neck thick as a tree trunk, and hauled 280 pounds of dying wolf onto the frozen bank by main strength alone, strength that came from 6 years of hauling firewood, water, and her father's failing body alone, strength nobody in Blackthorn had ever bothered to notice because they were too busy noticing her patched coat and her father's ruined name. The wound was in the beast's shoulder, deep, cauterized wrong, packed with something that glittered even in moonlight, silver, ground fine as sand, worked directly into torn muscle. Illyra's hands went still over it, the way they always did, when the shape of an injury told her something the wound itself wasn't saying. She had seen this exact wound pattern once before, drawn in her father's careful hand in the margin of his private journal, beside a sketch of a curved dagger and 3 words underlined twice, not an accident. She packed the wound with yarrow and pressed silverbane paste, a recipe of her father's own invention, one no court healer in Blackthorn had ever learned, directly against the raw muscle, murmuring instructions to a creature that could not possibly understand human speech, and stayed crouched over him through the entire freezing night, feeding the fire, changing the poultice every hour, refusing to let a stranger's heartbeat stop on her watch, the way her father's had stopped on nobody's. The fire she'd built beside the frozen bank burned low and orange through the deepest hours, and twice she left the beast's side only long enough to break more deadwood, her fingers numb inside soaked gloves, the smell of scorched pine mixing with the copper tang of blood, and the sharp, almost metallic bite of silver dust still clinging to the wound's edges. By dawn, the shoulder wound had closed enough that the beast's breathing had steadied from a rattling wheeze into something almost even, and that was when the shape beneath her hands began to change, bone shifting, fur receding into skin, the 9-foot frame collapsing inward until a man lay in its place, naked and shivering on the frost-hardened bank, dark hair plastered to a jaw carved sharp enough to cut, and eyes that opened and fixed on her the color of struck gold, gold that deepened toward amber as awareness returned to them. He was easily 6.5 feet even lying down, a scar running from collarbone to ribs on his left side that looked decades older than the fresh wound she'd just packed, and around his neck, half buried in his own blood, a chain bearing a signet ring stamped with a wolf's head crowned in laurel, the Blackthorn royal seal. His forearms bore 3 older, paler scars, each a story she couldn't yet read, and when he finally exhaled, the sound came out as a low rumble that vibrated through the frozen ground beneath her knees, a sound she felt in her chest before she registered it as anything close to a growl. Elira had spent 6 years being invisible to the pack that wore that seal. She did not recognize him. She only saw a patient, and she told him, flatly, to stop trying to sit up before he tore the stitches she'd just placed in muscle that wasn't finished knitting. His name was Calen Vantor Ashgrave, 31 years old, Alpha King of Blackthorn, for the past 9 years since his father's death, and he had been ambushed 2 nights prior on a routine border ride by 6 mercenaries, wielding silver-forged blades no ordinary hunter could afford. An ambush his own second-in-command would later confirm had been reported to nobody, scheduled by nobody, meaning someone inside the hall itself had leaked his route. He did not tell Elira any of this on the riverbank. He only watched her hands work with a focus that unsettled him more than the pain did, because in 9 years of rule, he had been tended by court healers who trembled reciting his own titles back to him, and this woman knelt in the mud with his blood under her fingernails and told him, without a flicker of deference, to hold still or bleed to death being stubborn. When he finally asked her name, voice still wolf-rough, she said only, Elira, and did not offer a surname, because she had learned 6 years ago exactly what that surname cost her in this territory. He insisted, against her flat objection, on walking the 2 miles back toward Blackthorn Hall, rather than let her half carry him the whole distance, pride outweighing sense in the particular way she'd already catalogued as typical of large wounded men. And it was on that walk, cresting the final ridge above the hall's outer wall, that 4 guards on patrol spotted them and went white as birch bark, dropping to one knee in the frozen mud before Elira had even processed why. "My king," the lead guard breathed, and Elira felt the ground shift, under a realization that arrived a full 3 seconds too late. The wolf she'd hauled out of a half-frozen river with her bare hands. The wolf whose shoulder she'd packed with her father's silverbane paste, while calling him nothing more than "hold still," was the sovereign of the entire pack that had exiled her father and left her to freeze in a cabin with a broken roof for 6 straight winters. If you've made it this far, you already know how this feels. The moment you realize the person you helped without asking questions was never who you thought. Hit subscribe now, because the next part is where the whole pack finds out exactly what she did and exactly who her father was, and it does not go the way any of them expect. Calen Ashgrave did not release her arm even as his own guards knelt in the frost, and when the captain of his personal guard, a broad-shouldered wolf named Commander Rurik Thane, arrived at a dead run from the hall's gate having heard his king was found alive, the first words out of Rurik's mouth upon seeing who stood beside him were not relief but suspicion, sharp and immediate. "That's the crow's daughter," Rurik said, loud enough for the 4 kneeling guards to hear, golden eyes narrowing on Alira, with the same contempt he'd worn every single time she passed his patrol route these past 6 years. Doran Vantas's girl. My king, you don't know what her father. Kaelin's hand tightened, once, hard enough that Rurik stopped mid-sentence, and the Alpha King's voice came out low and final. Her father's name is not the matter at hand, Commander. My shoulder is. Rurik's jaw worked, golden eyes flicking to Alira, with a look that promised this conversation was only delayed, not finished, and he fell into step a pace behind them, radiating a hostility that made the walk through Blackthorn Hall's outer gates feel considerably longer than the 2 miles that preceded it. Inside the hall, word spread faster than the guards could outpace it. By the time Alira had finished redressing Kaelin's wound properly on a proper bed, with proper linens and a proper physician's kit that made her father's dented brass case look like a beggar's toolkit by comparison, half the pack's ranking wolves had gathered in the corridor outside, drawn by a rumor already twisting in 3 different directions. Among them stood Councilman Varric Ashgrave, Kaelin's father's younger brother, silver-templed and soft-spoken in the particular way of men who had spent decades perfecting the appearance of harmlessness. Varric had served as regent for the 11 months between the old king's death and Kaelin's coming of age, a role he had performed, by every outward account, with flawless loyalty, and a role he had never once, in 9 years since, stopped quietly resenting having lost. He offered Alira a smile as thin as paper when introduced, complimented her steady hands in a tone that somehow made the compliment sound like an accusation, and asked, with studied casualness, exactly where she had learned wound care of this particular caliber. Alira answered that her father had taught her. Varric's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did, cataloging, calculating, the way a man recalculates a debt he thought he'd buried. Kaelin refused every court physician sent to oversee his recovery over the following 8 days, insisting instead that Alira remain in the hall as his personal healer, a decision that scandalized the council and delighted absolutely no one but the king himself. She was given a small chamber near the infirmary wing, plain stone walls and a narrow bed, worlds better than her collapsed roof cabin, and still, pointedly, nowhere near the guest quarters reserved for anyone the pack actually respected. She didn't complain. She had learned 6 years ago that complaining changed nothing except how much energy she had left to survive the day. She simply worked, checking his shoulder twice daily, reapplying Silverbane paste that visibly outperformed anything the court physicians murmured about behind closed doors, and refusing, every single time he tried, to let Kaelin charm information out of her about her father's exile with anything more than a flat, "Ask the council," they wrote the record. He asked anyway, every day, in different ways, watching her with the particular attentiveness of a man cataloging every place his assumptions had been wrong. He had assumed, the first morning, that a woman living alone on the territory's edge for 6 years would be brittle, defensive, perhaps looking to profit from proximity to a king. Instead, she rebandaged his shoulder with brisk efficiency and told him, without a trace of flattery, that his wound care instincts as a patient were terrible, and he needed to stop testing his range of motion out of impatience. He found himself, against every instinct 9 years of rule had trained into him, wanting to earn a compliment from a woman who clearly had no intention of giving him one for free. On the 5th day, when Rurik cornered her alone in the corridor outside the infirmary, and repeated, low and vicious, that she was nothing but a fragile little bird playing healer, riding a king's gratitude straight into a grave she'd dug for her own father, Kaelin heard it through the half-open door, and the growl that rolled out of his chest was audible 3 rooms away. Varric, for his part, grew subtler rather than louder. He began appearing wherever Alira's rounds took her, the herb stores, the eastern courtyard, the library archive where she went one evening searching, quietly, for any record of the ceremonial daggers carried by the old royal guard 2 decades past. He found her there on the 6th night, offered to help her search, and steered her, with practiced ease, away from the very shelf she'd been circling. She noticed. She said nothing. She had learned from her father that the men most eager to help you look somewhere are usually the ones most afraid of what you'll find if you look somewhere else, and she filed Varric's helpfulness away beside the memory of a sealed letter under her cabin's floorboards, bearing a crest she was beginning to suspect, matched the signet ring on the councilman's own smallest finger. The turn came on the 10th night, during the Blackthorn Hall's autumn gathering, a formal dinner marked by long oak tables lit with 40 iron candelabras, the air thick with roasted venison, spiced wine, and the low murmur of 200 wolves in their finest dark wool. A dinner Kaelin insisted Alira attend as his personal healer, despite the council's visible discomfort at seating a human woman with no title anywhere near the high table. Rurik, 3 cups of spiced wine into the evening, and emboldened by an audience of ranking wolves, raised his voice deliberately as Alira crossed the hall in a borrowed gray dress that fit poorly at the shoulders, announcing to the table at large that he'd heard the king's new healer had once treated a merchant's cough with nothing but river mud and hope, that Doran Vantis's daughter was, in his exact words, playing physician the way a child plays queen, costume and nothing underneath. The hall's laughter was scattered but real, and Alira felt every year of 6 winters of exactly this kind of contempt land at once, cold and familiar. She did not flinch. She set down the tray she carried, met Rurik's golden eyes across the length of the table, and said evenly that she'd be glad to compare his knowledge of wound sepsis against hers in front of the entire council whenever he liked, because unlike him, she'd actually kept someone alive this month. Kaelin stood so fast his chair scraped a foot across stone. He did not raise his voice. His authority had never needed volume, but the growl beneath his words made 3 wolves at the nearest table set down their cups. "Commander," he said, "you will apologize to the healer who has kept this pack's king breathing for the past 10 days, or you will find another alpha to serve." Rurik's face went the color of old ash. He apologized, stiffly, publicly, and Alira accepted it with a nod cold enough that Varric, watching from the far end of the table with his paper-thin smile fixed in place, quietly recalculated exactly how much of a problem this healer was becoming, because a king defending a commoner's honor in front of the full council was not the behavior of a man merely grateful for medical care. Later that night, on the ramparts above the eastern courtyard where she'd gone to breathe air that didn't smell of wine and old resentment, Kaelin found her, and for the first time since the riverbank, neither of them spoke about wounds or duty. He told her, quietly, that in 9 years of rule, no one at that table had ever spoken to him the way she had that first morning on the ice, like his life mattered more than his crown did. She told him just as quietly that she'd pulled him out of that river without knowing his name, because a dying man deserves saving whether or not anyone remembers to thank him for it, the way nobody had thanked her father for 30 years of service before they exiled him on a rumor. The confession slipped out before she meant it to. Kaelin went very still, golden eyes darkening toward amber, and asked her, for the first time directly, exactly what had happened to Doran Vantis 6 years ago. And this time, watching his face, she found herself, for the first time in 6 years, wanting to actually answer. She told him everything that night on the ramparts, the exile, the vague charge of conduct unbecoming a royal healer that the council record never bothered to specify, her father's slow decline in a border shack with a wound that refused to heal no matter what she packed it with, and the letter, sealed with a crest she'd never been able to place, that he'd told her to burn and never explained. 2 nights later, in the privacy of his own chamber with the door barred, Alira finally broke the seal her father had guarded for 6 years, and the letter inside, written in a hand she now recognized from council correspondence, detailed a private arrangement between VA and a mercenary contact regarding removal of the healer before he identifies the wound pattern, dated 3 weeks before Doran Vantis's exile. Kaelin read it twice, jaw tight enough to crack, and said the 2 initials matched exactly one man in Blackthorn Hall who signed correspondence that way, his uncle. The final piece fell into place the following morning, when Kaelin's own second-in-command, not Rurik, but an older wolf named Bastian Cade, who had served 3 kings and trusted almost no one, brought forward, quietly and at great personal risk, a ceremonial dagger recovered from the mercenary camp responsible for Kaelin's near-fatal ambush at the river, a dagger with a curved blade that matched precisely the sketch in Doran Vantis's private journal, and a hilt bearing the Ashgrave family crest, reserved exclusively for the regent's household. Varric Ashgrave, it turned out, had never stopped resenting the 11 months of power he'd tasted as regent, and lost the moment his nephew came of age. 11 months during which he'd reshaped council appointments, tax levies, and border patrols entirely to his own liking, only to surrender every thread of it the day Kaelin turned 25. He had poisoned Doran Vantas's wound 20 years ago, after the healer identified silver-shaving toxicity in a hunting accident that had nearly killed Varric's rival for the regency, engineered the healer's exile on a fabricated charge before he could speak further, and now, watching his nephew grow close to the very healer's daughter, who might finally recognize the old wound pattern, had hired the same Silverblade mercenaries to eliminate Kaelin before Alira's medical knowledge could unravel 2 decades of buried guilt. Bastion's evidence, combined with the letter, was enough to invoke the Blackthorn founding law carved into the hall's own archway, the ancient right granting a hearing and a named boon to anyone who saved a royal bloodline from death by their own unrewarded skill. Kaelin called the full council to session at dawn, in the frost-covered training yard where 200 wolves could stand witness, and sent word that Varric Ashgrave would answer, publicly, for a crime 20 years buried. 200 wolves gathered in the training yard at first light, breath fogging in the frost, boots crunching frozen mud into ice, banners bearing the Blackthorn wolf and laurel crest snapping in a wind sharp enough to sting exposed skin. And at the center of it all stood Alira in her patched gray coat, Doran Vantas's dented brass case in her hands, facing a council table where Varric Ashgrave sat with his paper-thin smile finally, visibly, cracking at the edges. Kaelin stood beside her rather than above her, a placement the entire gathered pack noticed and murmured over, and when Bastion Cade laid the recovered dagger and the 20-year-old letter before the council, Varric's composure shattered into something desperate and loud, accusing Alira of forgery, of manipulation, of exactly the kind of scheming ambition he'd suspected from the Crow's daughter since the moment she set foot in the hall. It was Alira who answered him, voice carrying flat and clear across the frozen yard with no tremor in it at all. She described, in precise clinical detail no forger could fabricate, the exact toxicology of a silver-shaving wound cauterized wrong. The same wound she'd treated on Kaelin's shoulder 8 days prior, the same wound pattern documented in her father's private journal 20 years earlier, the same signature poison that had killed a healer the council once called incompetent, and now, standing in the frost, could no longer pretend was anything but murdered. Rurik Thane, who had called her a fragile little bird playing physician not 2 weeks before, stood at the edge of the gathered guard with his golden eyes fixed on her, and when the council formally confirmed the dagger's crest against Varric's own signet ring, it was Rurik's voice, unprompted, that broke the silence. She was never fragile. We just never bothered to look. The words landed exactly where her exile had begun, inverted, in front of every wolf who'd ever repeated the old contempt. Varric's own household staff, questioned under the council's direct authority, produced a servant, young, terrified, loyal to Varric for years, out of fear rather than devotion, who confirmed under oath that he had personally delivered payment to the mercenary camp on his master's orders, not 2 weeks before the river ambush. The betrayal from within Varric's own house was the final nail. The council, per the founding law's own ancient terms, stripped him of title, land, and name in a single unanimous vote, and Kaelin, exercising the sovereign right no council could override, banished his uncle from Blackthorn territory before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, forbidding him ever to cross the border again on pain of death. Then, before the full assembly, he turned to Alira, took her hand in front of 200 witnesses, and invoked the founding law's boon owed to her, declaring, so every wolf in the yard could hear it, that the healer they had called broken for 6 years would be named Luna of Blackthorn, his equal and his chosen mate, by his word and the ancient law both. 3 weeks passed before Blackthorn Hall settled fully into its new shape. Varric Ashgrave's exile was confirmed absolute when border scouts reported him last seen crossing into neutral territory to the south, stripped of rank, wealth, and the family name he'd spent 2 decades protecting at the cost of an innocent man's life, a fall the council recorded, coldly, as the price the founding law had always promised, traitors of the bloodline. Rurik Thane, formally reprimanded before the full council for conduct unbecoming a commander, spent those 3 weeks assigned to the coldest, most thankless border patrol in Blackthorn's territory, and on the one occasion he crossed paths with Alira again. In the hall's lower corridor, he stopped, golden eyes lowered, and offered an apology with none of his old sneer in it. An apology she accepted, briefly and without warmth, because she had learned from her father that forgiveness didn't require forgetting. The servant who'd testified against Varric was granted formal pardon and a place in Bastian Cade's household guard, the closest thing to protection the terrified young wolf had ever known. Doran Vantis's name was formally cleared before the full council. His exile record burned in the same ceremonial fire that had once, decades ago, sealed his ruin, and a healer's monument bearing his name was raised in the hall's eastern garden, the first monument in Blackthorn history, dedicated to a human, its base carved with a single line from his own journal. Strength does not announce itself, it simply endures. Elira stood before it the morning it was unveiled, Kaelin's hand steady at the small of her back, and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. 200 wolves who had once called her the Crow's daughter now called her Luna, and every single one of them bowed when she passed. Her coronation took place beneath the same frost-covered sky where her father's name had once been dragged through the mud, snow falling in slow, deliberate spirals over the assembled pack, torches lining the training yard's stone wall in place of the frost that had witnessed her trial weeks before, Kaelin's crown resting beside her own newly forged circlet of silver and black iron, etched along its inner band with 3 small words only she would ever read, "For Doran's daughter." And when he pressed his forehead to hers in front of the assembled pack, and murmured that he would spend every year of his reign proving he deserved a woman who'd saved his life expecting nothing in return, she thought, quietly, of a girl who once believed strength only counted if someone else was watching, and understood, finally, standing crowned in the same yard where she'd been despised, that the watching had never been the point at all. Wasn't it strange, she thought, how the ones who called you broken were always the first to kneel once they saw what you'd been carrying the entire time? Somewhere south of the border, in a territory that had not yet heard the name Varric Ashgrave, a caravan of exiled wolves was quietly gathering, drawn by a rumor of a stripped nobleman offering gold for anyone willing to march north again, and none of them yet knew the healer who'd broken him once would be waiting. If you want to see what happens when he comes back, you already know what to do. You watch this whole story because some part of you needed to see her win. Subscribe now, because that part of you isn't done yet.